Hello, my name's Lisa Siberry and I'm the author of The Brilliant Ideas of Lily Green. I would like to say a big hello to all you kids out there who love reading and writing. I love reading and writing too, and this is where I do a lot of it. It's my little writing office. It kind of has everything I need to be creative. So it has a big window that I can stare out of all day and waste a bit of time thinking. It has my writing gloves to keep my fingers warm during the winter. A jar full of crazy pens, very important for writing down my ideas. And most important of all, I have my lolly jar. So now that we've done the grand tour, how about we dive into some writing tips? Because when I was a kid, I loved writing stories, but I didn't really know how to do it. I didn't know who to ask. We didn't even have the internet back then, can you imagine? So maybe you want to be a writer or a storyteller one day. There are actually a few tricks that you can keep up your sleeve to get your story down on the page. So I'm going to give you my top 5 creative writing tips for kids, and at the end we're going to do some fun writing exercises. You ready to go? All right, here we go. Tip number 1 is to write what you love. I know that sounds a bit obvious, but often we can be tempted to write stories that we think other people are going to like reading, when really I think you need to begin with writing a story that you would love to read. You have your own voice that the world wants to hear. So have a think about what kind of stories excite you. Which authors do you admire? Do you like stories about cats? Do you like stories about cats that turn into humans? Do you like stories about jumping llamas or stories with lots of action and adventure? Whatever you love, follow that. There are so many different types of stories in the world. Find what excites you. So for example, the idea for my book, Lily Green, came from some of the things that I loved doing when I was a kid. I've always liked stories about real life with a magical twist. In fact, when I was about 9 years old, I used to sit on the wall at the very end of my backyard, and I used to look over the wall into the neighbour's garden behind us. Now, it was so overgrown and it felt like a jungle, and it seemed to be full of so many mysterious, creepy things to me. I mean, looking back, it was probably just a garden full of weeds, but when I was 9, it seemed to be full of magic. I even used to sometimes pick little flowers from the garden, and I would put them in a jar with some water, and I would swish the water around, and then I would leave it overnight. And I always hoped that when I woke up in the morning, it would have turned into some kind of beautiful, magical perfume. Of course it didn't. Of course it was just brown, gloopy water, but I still had hope that there was something magical in that garden. And you know what? I never forgot that, because one day, many years later, I was standing in a shop and I just suddenly thought, what if I wrote a story about a girl who invents magical lip balm? Well, I rushed home and I started writing, and I started throwing in all the other things that I loved when I was a kid. Like, I loved creepy plants. I loved the idea of shampoo that might turn my hair into a magical shape. I loved the idea of a science competition and a girl at school who wasn't being very nice to me. I liked the idea of a bossy sister. I took all of those things and I threw them into the story. And then along came my character, Lily Green, and suddenly it turned into a story. So my point is, take all of the things that you love and throw them into your story, because you never know where they're going to take you. Which leads me to my second tip, which is take lots of notes. Writers are basically like spies. Every time I get a tram, I eavesdrop on people's conversations. I'm always staring at people, listening to people. Sometimes I get caught spying, but that's okay because I figure it's all material, right? So make sure you always have a notebook on hand. I have lots of notebooks, heaps, and I write all of my ideas in them. Ooh, a creepy doll. I really want to use that one day. But often I go back to those notes. It's like digging for gold, looking for things that might spark my imagination. Paintings of posh dead people. For example, last year I was thinking about 2 girls and their name were Hannah Plum and Patty Wu, and I wrote these names down in my notebook. And then a few months later, I found that note again in my notebook, and I decided I wanted to write a story about these two girls. Well, that story actually grew into a book series called Plum and Wu, and all it started with was the names of two girls that I wrote down in my notebook. Also, you don't have to just write ideas, you can also do some drawings or paintings. Maps are also a really good help. I find that sometimes I will draw out a map of a world, of a story, before I even begin. And that map can actually sort of be a map for my story as well for me when I'm writing it. The more detail you can jot down and put in your notebooks, the better, because that's all material for your stories. Which takes me to tip number 3. Create characters with delicious details. I'll tell you a story. When I was about 7, I had a dollhouse, and in that dollhouse lived a rabbit doll and a hedgehog doll. They were just 2 dolls in a dollhouse, but I used to make up so many stories between the rabbit and the hedgehog. They would have tea parties, they would fight monsters, they would have wonderful adventures. And what I learnt from that is that stories are all about characters, and you may only have a hedgehog and a rabbit, but you can still create a cool story. Most importantly, you need to think about who is the star of your story. What makes them special? What are their secret talents? What are their flaws? So flaws are things that aren't so perfect about them. Sometimes that can be really interesting as well. What does your character look like? How do they walk? Do they like to sleep in? What do they like to eat? All of these things can help round out your character if you know them. A good character has to be really distinct, and sometimes a good way to do that is to be able to describe your character in 3 words. I often do this for my characters because it kind of helps me remember who they are when I'm writing. If you think of anybody, you can usually describe them in 3 words, right? Like, imagine your best friends. How would you describe them in just 3 words? I'll have a turn. I have 2 best friends. They're called Stephen and Danielle. Stephen I would describe as fun, fashionable, and sparkly. Whereas Danielle I would describe as kind, clever, and brave. So can you already see how my 2 friends are quite different just by those 3 words that I used to describe them? I always try to have my 3 words in my head when I'm writing about my characters. That way I can weave it into their dialogue, the way they walk, the way they're dressing, so that when you read them on the page, you really get a sense of who they are. I find this technique especially useful for villains because, as we know, every good story has a villain. And the thing about bad guys is that they don't have to be the classic moustache twirling baddies. Your villain could be anybody. It could be an old woman stealing jewels from the museum and hiding them in her knitting bag. Your villain could be a regular 10-year-old boy who has a secret grudge against all the popular kids at school. Villains are usually normal people with a bad attitude. So try to think about your villain's background. Give them as much love and detail as your hero. If you think about a lot of the classic villains from children's books, they all have their own story to tell. So for instance, you've got Miss Trunchbull from Matilda. She was a really evil principal. She did so many awful things to Matilda, but basically at the end of the day, she just wanted people to do what she said, right? She had her own motivation. So your villains, they have goals as well. So try and give them lots of wonderful detail that will really annoy the hero of your story, because what you want is lots of complication in your story. Which brings me to tip number 4, create problems for your characters. You might be writing your story and your hero's having a wonderful day and he's going about and he's just having a great time, which is great, but that's not actually so great for your story because good stories have big problems. I mean, big problems. Maybe your hero discovers he's living next door to a vampire, or he's about to be attacked by killer llamas. If you can, give your character something really big to deal with, lots of trouble. Writers use a fancy word to describe that. They call it the inciting incident. but it really is just about creating mischief in the story. Readers want action and fun and problems galore. So why not brainstorm some? Sit down and think about your character. Think about what's the worst thing that could happen to them. What would make them really scared? What would make them really nervous? What would make them really excited? Think about all the things that you can throw at them and then go with that. Oh wait, what? What's that I hear? You're worried that maybe your idea isn't so great? Maybe your story isn't perfect? Well, welcome to tip number 5. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Really, I wrote 5 drafts of the brilliant ideas of Lily Green. 5 drafts! That's because the first draft that I wrote, really, it was kind of like a half-baked cake. I had to go back and I had to add ingredients and I had to do some more stirring and I had to put the cake back in the oven and let it rise and get golden. Because writing takes time, and that is okay. So don't worry if the first draft of your story isn't perfect. Personally, I think that perfect is kind of boring. I think that if you make lots of mistakes and try lots of new things, you're actually going to find something much more interesting. And whatever you do, don't talk to Frank. Who is Frank, you ask? Well, Frank is the name that I give to the voice that sometimes shows up in my head after I've done a really messy draft. And it's the voice that says,
"You're not a real writer, are you? That's not real writing. I read so much better than that. You should stop. No one's gonna read that. What are you doing? It's silly. It's so silly. You should stop now. No, 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 no!"
If I listened to Frank, I wouldn't be a writer. I would have given up a long time ago. So whenever Frank shows up, do you know what I say to him? Thanks for your opinion, but I'm not going to listen to you today. I'm going to go back to my draft and I'm going to make it better. And then I'm going to show it to people and I'm not going to be afraid. So if you have a little voice that sounds a little bit like Frank, who might occasionally tell you that you're not very good at something, try not to listen to that. Just keep going, keep writing. Because you know what? Making mistakes is natural. And that's why they put erasers on the end of pencils, right? Now that we've gone through our writing tips, let's try to put it all into practice and do a few writing exercises. The first writing exercise I call the What If Challenge, and it's a pretty classic writing exercise, but it's a really good one. So what I want you to do is I want you to start with 2 words. They are what if, and then I want you to add something really wacky to the end of it. Like, what if dogs could talk? Or, what if you discovered a hole underneath your bed that led to a dragon's nest? Anything, whatever, go crazy. Come up with 5 what if sentences, and then choose one that you really like and use it to start a story. You never know what will happen. Writing exercise 2. I call this Diary of a Famous Nobody. So I want you to choose 3 characters or famous people. It could be anybody. It could be somebody that you like on TV. It could be a character in a book that you like. Anybody. 3 people. Now I want you to choose one and I want you to pretend that you're writing their diary. So a day in their life. This is a good exercise for putting yourself inside a character's head. It's also a great way to learn how to write from the first person perspective, which is I, as in I went to the shops and bought a bag of lollies. You can do drawings, you can do scribbles, anything you like. Pretend it's your own diary, but just make sure you put yourself in the shoes of the person that you're writing from. This is a really good way to get inside a character's head. All right, writing exercise 3. Let's call it Pass It On. You're going to need a partner for this one, so it could be a friend or an adult. Now you're going to start. All you need is a piece of paper and a pen. What you're going to do is you're going to write for 2 minutes. You're basically writing the beginning of a story. So start with anything. It could be, once upon a time I woke up with green hair. Da 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 da. Keep going. When 2 minutes finishes, pass the story on to your friend or your partner. And then it's going to be their turn to continue the story for another 2 minutes. Then when they're done, it's going to come back to you for another 2 minutes. Back and forth, keep going. See how long you can keep the story going for. See where you can take the story. It's really fun to see what you can do when there are two people creating a story together. I hope all these tips and exercises have got your brain sparkling with ideas, and I hope you all go on to write lots of wonderful stories. All right, good luck and happy writing.